Now today you're going to talk to us about tetanus and anthrax. Shall we start with tetanus? Can you tell me a bit about its prevalence?
Okay, so tetanus in livestock nowadays, certainly in this part of the world, does not seem to be a big problem because we vaccinate, routinely producers vaccinate against it in their cattle and their sheep in vaccines, 5-in-1s, 3-in-1s, 7-in-1s, 8-in-1s. And that gives really good protection. And for the tetanus, it lasts 12 months, so it fits nicely within a routine cycle of vaccine every year. It's in the ground all the time. The germ seems to be in the guts of animals all the time. And every so often we do get breakdowns where people have changed management procedures or whatever. So I suppose the last case I saw a couple of years ago now, producer bought a new property, brought in 3 separate flocks of sheep to stock the property. They then gave birth, and when they gave birth at slightly different times, so he was trying to get everything together. So when it came to vaccinating the lambs and marking the lambs, so that's castrating and cutting the tails off, shortly after that, he was getting these animals going down, collapsing. And what had happened was the maternal antibody protection from the colostrum had faded in the older ones. So he was waiting until the youngest ones were old enough to vaccinate. And so there was a window of opportunity and the older ones went down with it. He had some quite significant losses with that. We knew that it was what the problem was pretty easily once we got out and had a look, but he was worried about other things, etc. So I suppose that's pretty common around here. Sorry, it's not common, but it's that sort of situation where we see it because, of course, the germ gets into open wounds, even though it's in the body all the time. It does seem that the wounds that cause problems are not the big open gashes where plenty of air gets into the wound, but it's much more like the smaller wound where the wound heals up quickly, seals the germs in the tissues, and the tissues are bruised, and that's where those germs love to get to. We don't always see the clear-cut shaking and classic tension of the muscles. I do remember seeing one a few years back now where it was a cattle, a beef animal, and it was showing vague signs of stiffness, and I didn't pick up that it was tetanus per se. It's very difficult to diagnose really in that mild case. We gave antibiotic treatments, but antibiotics don't necessarily kill or control the disease, because the disease, of course, is caused by the toxin rather than the active germ itself. But in fact, this animal did recover, but it was a very mild one. And in hindsight, I think that's probably what it was. Horses are notorious because not all animals have the same level of susceptibility to it. Horses are notorious in being very susceptible to it. And so they get the traditional lockjaw appearance, rocking horse gait, legs straight out, back arched, where the extensor muscles are stronger than the flexor muscles, so they get this sort of rigid appearance. And we do see that from time to time. And in veterinary practice, we can use either antitoxins or toxoids, where the toxoid is the vaccine and the antitoxin is supposed to neutralize the toxin. So once the disease has started. So How effective that is, because the respiratory muscles tend to get paralyzed, is open to debate. And because obviously, especially in horses, you're going to need a lot, and it gets quite expensive for a horse or animals of that size.
You've mentioned sheep and cattle and horses. Are there other livestock that are affected by tetanus?
Yeah, pretty much all of the mammals are going to be affected by it. But as I say, there's a bit of a variation between the susceptibility of these different species. Dogs are another one that can get it, but they don't seem to get it as much as those. I've ever seen it. I don't think I've ever seen it in dogs or cats, but it does occur.
And the symptoms you mentioned were shaking and muscle tension, the lockjaw, the rocking horse stance, spread. Are there other symptoms that livestock present with?
I think, though, the other one that they present with is sudden death. Often they go unnoticed, and the first thing the producer finds is that he's got a dead animal. We don't actually make a diagnosis of tetanus very often just on that, because there's no real specific signs, but it's usually then the lead in to keeping closer watch, and then you see the clinical signs. And I remember that case of the sheep I was telling you about. He'd got some animals which he'd found dead. He then took a video of some live ones that he found the next day, and that was what led me to the diagnosis, and I was able to go out and be on the property with him. But he did have some other issues of management, which did make me think of some of the other problems like hypermagnesemia, which would show some of the similar tremorings at that time of year, but we could rule those out by other means. So it's a lovely differential in the list.
Mm-hmm. And the treatment you mentioned is vaccine. How often is that generally administered?
So the vaccines that we use for tetanus, they come in a mixture with various other clostridial vaccines, plus or minus things like leptospira. And the muscle type clostridia, so blackleg and tetanus, 1 year is often enough to vaccinate for that. But because we're using multivalent vaccines, we're getting also treatment for some of the Clostridial perfringens and stuff like that, which lives in the gut and develops gut type disease. And there we need to vaccinate probably every 3 months. Because the stresses of dietary change will allow those germs to multiply. And because tetanus is included in that mixture, they're getting more than enough clostridial protection for tetanus as well as the other ones.
Right. And how's tetanus transferred to people?
Now that's an interesting one. All our species, it comes through primarily the gut and then gets dropped out onto the ground in feces. And when I was in England and used to read up on these things, because we did have several when I was sort of much younger, outbreaks there, they used to say that the biggest single source of tetanus infection in people was from horse manure. And that was through people putting horse manure on their roses, and then the spores survive in the soil for years, and they will then get into the bruised tissue where people get themselves spiked when they're pruning their roses, and that's where the tetanus gets. So that's what's in my mind of the medicos saying how people get affected, but I would stand corrected obviously on that one. But again, other animals will get infected by eating the spores, which will be in the soil, and then the worms and so forth can bring those spores up to the surface, and along with other clostridias, they can be on the soil that a lot of them will eat when they're grazing in when it's all dry and there's not much grass, and they eat the spores that way. And if they don't have the immunity, then it multiplies up.
Okay. And how can people protect themselves from getting tetanus?
It's a vaccine. So I think nowadays it's every 10 years from my, I think I'm probably about due. I'm supposed to get a vaccine. I used to get it every 5 years when there was a 5 on the end or a 0. Now I think it's 10 years, and I think it's when, for me, it's when there's a 1 on the end. So I'm probably due next year.
Don't forget.
Terrific.
Is there anything else about tetanus that you'd like to share before we move on to anthrax?
No, I don't think there's anything very much. It is very much, you very much emphasize the prevention rather than the cure. The cure is difficult, expensive, and nowhere near so successful as the preemptive vaccine.